Hi St. Aidans. Welcome to video 6 of our Inductive Bible Study Seminar. Today we're going to get into more interpretation. If you remember in the last video, we reconstructed the circumstances surrounding the letter to Philemon by looking at internal evidence, those clues in the text itself that tell us a little bit more information about what was going on before the writing of this letter. And then we also added external information or external evidence by looking at the first century world and the circumstances in the first century world, particularly slavery and prison circumstances. So in my summary of the story behind Philemon, I talked about Onesimus being a runaway slave who fled to Rome, and while he was there, he met up with Paul, encountered the gospel, and became a follower of Christ, and was a great partner to Paul's ministry. But because he was a former slave and a runaway slave, he needed to return to Philemon, and so Paul writes a letter of recommendation on his behalf and sends him back to Colossae with Tychicus, and sends him back with this letter to Philemon, where he appeals on Onesimus' behalf. So that kind of sets the stage for this letter that Philemon received. In this video, what we want to do is we want to use this information now to think about why Paul wrote the things that he did and how Philemon may have received them. So we want to take those things that we noticed and examined that we did earlier and use that and build on that and by asking some interpretation questions. So remember that in the step of interpretation, we want to step into the shoes of the author and the people that the letter was written to, so that we can understand what was meant by what was written. So we want to ask questions such as, what are the author's concerns? What are his convictions or his emotions? What are the original reader's concerns? What are their questions? What are their struggles? What are their problems and emotions and strengths and weaknesses? These are all things that we can think about as we're asking interpretation questions. We might want to ask, what is the meaning to the author or the original reader? Or what is the meaning of a word or a concept or a term or an event that is mentioned in the text? We might ask the question in terms of significance. What is the significance of a passage or something that's said in the passage, or a particular word that is used? We might want to think about how it relates to the surrounding context. How does it relate to what was said before or what is said after? So we're thinking about literary context in that case. And we always want to be asking why questions. Why questions are really key, and you just keep asking why over and over and over again. And that'll help you think about interpretation and think about what it means to the author and the reader.
I wonder why Pastor Dave is drinking coffee.
I wonder, how did Pastor Dave come to like coffee?
What does it mean that Pastor Dave is drinking coffee?
I wonder what it is about coffee that makes Pastor Dave drink it.
I wonder if Pastor Dave is drinking coffee because he's tired.
I wonder if Pastor Dave is addicted to coffee.
I wonder if Pastor Dave is drinking coffee because it helps him relax and maybe he's stressed out.
Let's take a look at the things that we noticed and examined in the letter to Philemon a couple videos ago, and let's pull that up and do some follow-up interpretation on those things. So let's ask some questions now about the author and the original reader, so that we can dig a little deeper into the text and why Paul wrote what he did to Philemon. So let's pull out the text, pull out your notes on the noticing and examining we did a couple days ago, And let's remind ourselves of what it is we actually noticed and examined in the text. So first of all, we notice the person mentioned, the person of Philemon, and we asked an examining question. We asked what is said about Philemon, and we discover that he is a beloved fellow worker, that there's a church that meets in his house, and that he's known for his love and faith toward Jesus and the saints, and that the hearts of the saints have been refreshed through him. And finally, that Paul calls him a brother. So in this step of interpretation, what I want to do is zero in on some of these details here and ask a follow-up question to that, and ask an interpretation question, thinking about why Paul wrote what he did, or what it meant to Philemon, just to step into their shoes and kind of think about what it meant to them. So my interpretation question here, my follow-up interpretation question is, what is implied by the reference to Philemon being a beloved fellow worker and a brother? So I think here Paul is recognizing Philemon as an equal, someone who is committed to the same ministry of the gospel, someone who is part of the same family, and someone loved by God, loved by Paul, even though Paul hasn't met him. He still loves Philemon and considers him part of his family and a partner in ministry. And it's on this basis of equality that Paul will address the issue surrounding Onesimus. Even though Paul could have approached him as an apostle, with that status of an apostle, instead he chooses to approach him as an equal, as a fellow worker, and as a brother. And I think that's significant to the point that Paul wants to make in terms of how he wants Philemon to respond to Onesimus. So we've asked an interpretation question here and tried to get at the heart of what Paul is doing, why Paul is saying the things that he is in this letter. So let's take a look at Onesimus. We noticed Onesimus mentioned in the text, and we asked the question, what is said about Onesimus? And we noticed that Paul calls Onesimus my child. And he tells Philemon that he, Paul, became Onesimus's father during his imprisonment. He also tells Philemon that Onesimus was at one time useless to him, but that he is now useful to both Philemon and Paul. So let's move into interpretation, and let's put ourselves in the shoes of Philemon. And let's think about Philemon. What was he thinking when he sees Onesimus show up at his home? So my first interpretation question here is, what would Philemon have been thinking initially when he saw that Onesimus had returned? Think about that for a minute. What would Philemon have been thinking? He may have been wondering how it is that Onesimus comes back, because Onesimus was a runaway slave, and to come back to his owner was kind of a risky thing to do, because he would be facing punishment. So why would Onesimus come back and show up again? He may have been thinking about what Onesimus owed him in terms of his work, or maybe property that he stole. So he might be thinking about what Onesimus had done to him. He could have been thinking about how he would handle this situation now that Onesimus had returned. What kind of response? Will he retaliate, or how will he respond? And he might be asking the question, like, what precedent would his actions set, Onesimus's actions set, for the rest of the household, or for the other slaves in Philemon's employ? So there might have been a lot of things going on in his mind as he sees Onesimus return. So let's ask a follow-up interpretation question to this, related to what Paul says. So I want to ask the question, what is the significance of Paul calling Onesimus my child and saying that he is now useful? What is the significance of that for Philemon. So I think it indicates that Paul figuratively considered Onesimus his son. Since he shared the gospel with him and led him to repentance and faith in Christ. So now Onesimus is part of his family. And there's a love that Paul has for Onesimus that he wants Philemon to know about. Paul is showing Philemon that he regards Onesimus as family and that Onesimus has changed, that once he was useless, now he's useful. And so he's changed since the last time Philemon saw him. He's loved by Paul, dear to him, and a valuable part of Paul's life and ministry. And he wants Philemon to see that Onesimus could be the same for him. He could be part of his family and part of his ministry as well. So he wants to change Philemon's mind on how Philemon is thinking about Onesimus. So we've done a little bit more interpretation on what is said about Onesimus in the text. Let's take a look at the contrast in verse 9, where we noticed the word yet, which indicates a contrast. And when we examined it, we asked the question, what is contrasted? And we noticed that Paul was could have been bold enough to command Philemon to do what was required, but that's contrasted to how he prefers to appeal for Onesimus instead. So let's ask some why questions here. In interpretation, you want to ask a lot of why questions. Why would Paul do this? Why is this important for Philemon? Why is it important for Onesimus? These are all things that we could ask. In this case, let's ask, why does Paul tell Philemon that he is bold enough to command, but would rather appeal to him instead? Why does he not just appeal to him? Why does he actually tell him, I could command you, but I'm going to appeal? I think here he wants to indicate that he's wanting a genuine response from Philemon. He's indicating that he respects Philemon enough to believe that he will respond favorably to his request. He's confident in Philemon's response, and that's why he's going to appeal rather than to command. So let's ask a follow-up question. Why? Why would it be better for Philemon's response to be genuine? Here's my thoughts on this. It's more likely that a genuine response will be long-lasting. It'll be something that has a long-reaching effect. It's a wholehearted commitment rather than something that's half-hearted and simply temporary. And so it has a more of an impact on the church around Philemon and on his ministry. So Paul is looking for something that's genuine and not something that is done out of obligation, because that is a sign of faith. A genuine willingness to forgive Onesimus is much more worth than just an obligation shown to him. And so that's an important expression of faith. So we can look at the other contrasts that we've highlighted in verses 13 and 14. Here we asked again that question, what is contrasted? We noticed that Paul's desire to keep Onesimus is contrasted to Paul's desire for Philemon's consent. And we asked a follow-up question there, what reason does Paul give for wanting to keep Onesimus with him? And Paul tells Philemon that he wants Onesimus around to help him in the midst of his imprisonment. That's why he wants him there. And then we asked another follow-up question, what reason does Paul give for wanting Philemon's consent? And here Paul explains that he wants to give Philemon the freedom to decide for himself whether Onesimus should serve him or not. So in interpretation, I can ask the question, why would Paul want Philemon to know that he would like to keep Onesimus with him? I've zeroed in there on one particular aspect of what we examined, and I'm asking a follow-up question here of why. Why would Paul want Philemon to know that he would like to keep Onesimus with him? And I think maybe it's to show that Philemon that Onesimus had changed, and perhaps to show Philemon that how he could actually support Paul's ministry by sending Onesimus back to him. So there might be maybe a little bit of a hint kind of thing here, where Paul is saying, hey, Onesimus is useful to you, but for me as well, and so if you want to be part of my ministry, here's how you can support me by sending Onesimus back, because I'd like to keep him. I'd like him to be part of my ministry. But he gives Philemon the option. So there he's showing again respect for Philemon's right as an owner of this slave Onesimus, but he's expecting Philemon to do something in Paul's favor as well. How about that repeated word love that we looked at? Let's do some follow-up on this one. So when we examined it, we asked what is said about love, and we noticed that Paul tells Philemon of how he has heard of his love toward Jesus and for all the saints, and how he has gained much joy and comfort from Philemon's love. We also noticed that in verse 19, he tells Philemon that it's for love's sake that he prefers to appeal to Philemon rather than to command. So let's zero in on what Paul says in verses 4 and 7 and ask an interpretation question. And here we want to ask again another why question that helps us get into the shoes and into the mind of Paul and Philemon. So I want to ask this question: why does Paul tell Philemon that he is known for his love and faith toward Jesus and his love for the saints? Why does he tell him that? It indicates that love is something that's characterized his ministry, and Paul commends him for that and encourages him in that. I think he wants to encourage Philemon to continue to do that because that's an important trait for a follower of Christ. And he wants to encourage him to continue to live in such a manner, especially as he deals with now being wronged by Onesimus. And he wants Philemon to show that same kind of love that he has shown other believers. He wants him to show that same kind of love to Onesimus, who is now a beloved brother and part of this family that makes up the church. So we've done a little bit more study of Philemon, digging in and doing some interpretation, asking some why questions, asking about why is Paul concerned about this? Why is he saying this? What was Philemon thinking about it? And we could ask questions about Onesimus. What would Onesimus be thinking and feeling when he hears this letter written by Paul? These are different questions and different approaches that we could take, and we'd come up with different answers. So this is an exciting part of inductive Bible study, is thinking about these people and how they would be thinking and responding. And it's in this way that we kind of get to know them a little bit and get to understand their world and what they're saying and dealing with. So it's your turn now. Take out the examining that you did on Paul or on the contrast in verse 16. Take out that examining, review it, take a look at the text again, and then ask and answer an interpretation question for each of them. And try your hand at interpretation. Here's some tips for doing interpretation. First of all, remember to put yourself in the shoes of the author or the original reader and think about them as people. Put yourself in the shoes of Paul. Imagine yourself under house arrest. Imagine yourself interacting with all these people that come and visit your home. Imagine yourself sharing the gospel with the guard that's chained to you. Put yourself in the shoes of Paul. Or Philemon, the original reader. Think about how he would deal with this runaway slave. Think about how he would respond to a letter written by Paul to him. You could also think about Onesimus. What would he be thinking in this situation? What would he be thinking about returning back to Philemon? What would he be struggling with that? Would that be something he would be afraid of, or is he eager to go back to see Philemon and be reconciled with him? These are all things that you can think about. Put yourself in their shoes and imagine the situation. You also want to ask a lot of why questions in interpretation. Always be asking why. Why is Paul doing this? Why would Philemon care about this? Why would Onesimus want to do this? Ask a lot of why questions. And use the information that you've gathered in noticing and examining to form your questions. Make them as specific as possible. Why does Paul say, "You're my brother"? Or why does Paul say, call Onesimus his child? It's specific to what he says in the text. So use your noticing and examining to form your why questions. And if in your answer you feel like you haven't gone deep enough, you can always ask another why question using your answer, and that might help you go a little deeper and think a little bit more about what the text meant to Paul and to Philemon. One thing that's difficult about interpretation is that the answer is not actually in the text. The answer to your interpretation questions is based on what we've seen in the text, but it's going beyond it and trying to get at the heart of the motivations and the heart of the individuals that are talked about in the text. So that's a challenging thing to do in interpretation, and takes some practice. So try it out, and if it doesn't work right away, then try again. And if you want some help or you have questions about it, I'm happy to answer questions or to provide a little bit more guidance on this. So feel free to reach out to me, and I'd be happy to help you with the step of interpretation and help you practice doing it. So in this video, we've practiced asking interpretation questions and stepping back in time and stepping into the shoes of the author and the original reader. We've thought about why Paul calls Philemon a beloved fellow worker and a brother. We've talked about the significance of Onesimus being called my child and the transformation that happened in his life because of Christ. We looked at why Paul wanted to appeal to Philemon rather than just commanding him, how he wanted a genuine response. We also talked about why Paul commends Philemon's love and and why he talks about his desire to see Philemon show that same love to Onesimus. So these are some of the things we've talked about and discovered as we've done the step of interpretation. In the next video, we're going to explore the step of application a bit more. We're going to talk about how these things are now relevant to me, because that's the goal of Bible study. We want to reach that point of application. So we'll see you in the next video.
I wonder if Pastor Dave knows the cream he used is 2 weeks overdue.
I wonder, is he thirsty?
Maybe he's stressed out.